The ordnance officers stared at the test results like they were reading their own death sentences. Late 1941, American arsenals possessed exactly 0 man-portable weapons capable of stopping a German Panzer III from the front. Not underpowered weapons, not inadequate weapons. 0. British intelligence reports flooding in from North Africa told the same brutal story. Rommel's tanks were shrugging off every anti-tank rifle round the Allies possessed. The standard 55 caliber Boys anti-tank rifle, Britain's ace, frontline answer to German armor, could barely dent the 50mm frontal plates on even the lighter Panzer variants. American arsenals looked worse. The Springfield Armory's experimental T3 anti-tank rifle existed only as blueprints gathering dust in filing cabinets. But the deeper problem wasn't hardware. It was chemistry. America's explosive production facilities had been mothballed since World War I, 2 decades of rust and neglect. When the War Department attempted to resurrect these plants in early 1941, they discovered something that should have terrified everyone paying attention. Modern German armor required far more explosive force than TNT could deliver pound for pound, and TNT was all America had. Chemical engineers at Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey ran penetration tests that September, using standard TNT-filled shaped charges against captured French tank plates. The results weren't just disappointing. They were dismal, barely 3 inches of penetration against homogeneous steel. German intelligence suggested their newer tanks featured face-hardened armor that would perform even better. Better for them. Catastrophic for anyone trying to stop them. This wasn't just outdated equipment. America's entire approach to military explosives had stagnated. The chemical formulas used in American munitions hadn't changed substantially since 1918. Ordnance officers were still specifying TNT for everything. Artillery shells, demolition charges, anti-tank weapons, despite knowing that European powers had moved far beyond it. The Germans had developed something called hexogen. The British called it RDX. Both nations were using it in combat. But American chemists knew almost nothing about how to synthesize it safely at scale. The few classified reports that crossed the Atlantic described factory explosions in Britain during early RDX production attempts. One blast at a Woolwich facility in 1940 killed 17 workers and injured 43 more. The explosion was so violent it shattered windows 3 miles away. Meanwhile, German tanks kept getting thicker armor. Intelligence photos from the Eastern Front in December 1941 showed new Panzer Pfeiffer variants with 80mm frontal plates. American infantry would be facing these monsters with nothing but grenades and prayer. The Army's rocket branch at Aberdeen Proving Ground had experimental shaped charge warheads, but they were mounted on clumsy launcher platforms that required 3-man crews and vehicle transport. Frontline soldiers needed something a single man could carry, aim, and fire before a tank's machine guns cut him down. The chemical formula to make that possible existed somewhere in German and British labs. But in America's hands, it might as well have been alchemy. Edward Uhl never set out to revolutionize anti-tank warfare. The 26-year-old Army lieutenant was simply trying to solve a persistent problem that had plagued every rocket launcher prototype, crossing his desk at the Ordnance Department's Research and Development Service in early 1942. Every design required elaborate sights, complicated firing mechanisms, shoulder stocks that made the weapons heavy and awkward. Uhl's superior, Colonel Leslie Skinner, had been wrestling with rocket-propelled grenades since 1940. None of his designs could deliver both accuracy and portability. The breakthrough happened on a spring afternoon in May 1942, and it was almost absurdly simple. O'Kale was examining a shaped charge grenade prototype in the Aberdeen Proving Ground workshop when Skinner walked in with a challenge. They needed a launcher that weighed less than 15 pounds, cost under $5 to manufacture, and could be operated by a soldier with minimal training. Uhl picked up a length of scrap steel tubing from a workbench. Ordinary electrical conduit, about 5 feet long, 2.36 inches in diameter. He held it to his shoulder like a makeshift telescope. The rocket motor's exhaust would vent harmlessly behind the shooter. No breech mechanism needed, no recoil absorption system required, just an open tube. Skinner immediately saw the elegance. Within 72 hours, they'd welded crude iron sights onto the tube, attached simple wooden shoulder stocks, and fabricated a basic electrical firing circuit using a flashlight battery and doorbell wire. The first test firing took place on May 14, 1942, at the Aberdeen Range. Uhl loaded a 3.5-pound rocket, essentially a finned pipe bomb with a shaped charge warhead, into the rear of the tube. He aimed at a wooden target frame 60 yards away and pressed the firing trigger. The rocket whooshed forward, trailing white smoke, and detonated on target. The entire weapon had cost $4.83 in materials. But hitting wooden frames meant nothing. They needed penetration data against actual armor plate. The Army trucked in sections of hull from a captured French Saumur tank. 45mm homogeneous steel, similar to what protected German Panzer III's. On May 21st, Uhl fired 3 rockets at the plate from 40 yards. The first punched through cleanly, leaving a hole the size of a baseball. The second penetrated and sent spalling fragments 30 feet behind the target. The third shot went slightly high, but still carved a crater 4 inches deep into the steel. Colonel Skinner reportedly grabbed the tube launcher from Uhl's hands and examined it like he'd found a magic wand. The name came later during a demonstration for Army brass in June. Major General Gladian Barnes watched Uhl fire the weapon and supposedly remarked that it looked like the musical instrument comedian Bob Burns played on radio. A jury-rigged trombone made from gas pipes that Burns called a bazooka. The name stuck immediately. By July 1942, the Ordnance Department had designated it the M1 rocket launcher and placed orders for 5,000 units. But the launcher was only half the equation. The rocket warhead itself still used conventional, explosive mixtures that barely achieved 4 inches of penetration. To punch through 6 inches of German steel, they would need chemistry that the US Army had explicitly banned from service. Britain's gift to American explosive chemistry arrived in a manila envelope during August 1942, carried by a Royal Navy courier who flew into Washington via Bermuda. Inside were 23 pages of typed formulas, temperature curves, and production specifications for something the British called Composition B. The document represented 2 years of dangerous trial and error at His Majesty's explosive research facilities, including the catastrophic lessons learned from the Woolwich disaster. Composition B wasn't a single chemical, but a carefully balanced mixture. 60% RDX, the high explosive compound both nations had been chasing, and 40% TNT, with a trace amount of wax added as a desensitizing agent. The British claimed it delivered 1.6 times the explosive force of pure TNT in shaped charge applications. RDX itself had a peculiar history. German chemist Georg Friedrich Henning first synthesized it in 1898, not as an explosive, but as a potential medicine. He published his findings in academic journals, never imagining the white crystalline powder would become a weapon. The compound's full chemical name, cyclotrimethylnitramine, was a mouthful. So everyone used the British military designation, Research Department Explosive, RDX. The Germans independently rediscovered it in the 1920s and began manufacturing hexogen for military use by 1935. British chemists at Woolwich Arsenal started their own RDX program in 1939 after captured German ordnance revealed its devastating properties. The American chemical establishment initially resisted adopting RDX for a straightforward reason. The stuff was viciously unstable during synthesis. The British manufacturing process involved combining hexamine, a compound commonly used in camping stove fuel, with concentrated nitric acid. This reaction generated enormous heat. If temperatures climbed above 25 degrees Celsius during the wrong phase, the mixture could detonate spontaneously. The Woolwich explosion happened when a cooling system failed during a summer heat wave. Workers had minutes to evacuate before 700 pounds of partially synthesized RDX detonated, collapsing an entire building. American chemists at the National Defense Research Committee studied the British documents throughout September 1942. Dr. Werner Emanuel Bachmann at the University of Michigan proposed modifications to the synthesis method that would reduce the explosion risk. His approach used acetic anhydride as a buffering agent and carefully controlled the nitric acid concentration. By October, Bachmann had successfully synthesized small batches of RDX in his university laboratory without incident. The War Production Board immediately authorized construction of dedicated RDX plants at 3 locations: Holston Ordnance Works in Tennessee, Wabash River Ordnance Works in Indiana, and Radford Arsenal in Virginia. The first American-made Composition B left the Holston plant in January 1943. Workers pressed the material into cylindrical molds under hydraulic pressure, creating explosive charges that would fit inside bazooka warheads. Initial penetration tests at Aberdeen showed significant improvement. The Composition B warheads punched through 4.5 inches of homogeneous steel plate at optimal angles, compared to just 3.2 inches for TNT-filled warheads. But German armor was already exceeding those thicknesses. The Panzer IV, Panther tanks entering production in early 1943, featured 80mm frontal armor set at sloped angles, effectively creating protection equivalent to 6 inches of vertical steel. American infantrymen would still be outgunned unless someone could coax more penetration from the same warhead diameter. That someone was already working on an unauthorized solution in a Harvard laboratory, mixing substances the Army had explicitly forbidden. Dr. George Kistiakowsky had a problem with authority, especially when authority interfered with good chemistry. The Ukrainian-born Harvard professor had fled the Bolsheviks in 1920, earned his doctorate in Berlin, and built a reputation studying explosive shockwaves that made him the obvious choice to lead the National Defense Research Committee's explosives research division in 1940 is in March 1943. Kistiakowsky had reviewed every bazooka penetration test from Aberdeen. The numbers frustrated him. Composition B represented excellent chemistry, but the warhead design was wasting its potential. The shaped charge cone inside each warhead was pressed from pure Composition B, which created a fundamental problem. The explosive was too brittle. It shattered unevenly when detonated, disrupting the precise jet formation needed for maximum penetration. Kistiakowsky knew from pre-war German research that adding finely powdered metal to plastic explosives could improve their detonation characteristics. Aluminum powder specifically could increase the temperature of the explosive jet while making the mixture more pliable during manufacturing. But there was a catch that made Army ordnance officers nervous. Aluminum powder mixed with oxidizing explosives created compositions that were significantly more sensitive to friction, impact, and static electricity. The British had banned aluminum-loaded explosives from their munitions plants after a series of accidents in 1941. American safety regulations followed suit. Army Ordnance Manual 3200 explicitly prohibited aluminum powder concentrations above 5% in any service explosive. Kistiakowsky ignored the regulation. Working in Harvard's Jefferson Physical Laboratory during April 1943, he formulated a mixture he labeled Composition B+. The recipe was deliberately provocative: 40% RDX, 40% TNT, 17% aluminum powder, 3% wax. The aluminum content was more than triple the permitted limit. He cast small test charges in his laboratory using equipment that would have horrified safety inspectors. Essentially, modified cake molds heated over Bunsen burners. The resulting material had a dull gray color instead of Composition B's yellowish tint. It felt slightly waxy to the touch, like sculptor's clay. The first penetration tests happened at a makeshift range Kistiakowsky, set up on Harvard property in May 1943. He couldn't use official Army facilities without revealing his unauthorized formula using scaled-down, shaped charge cones pressed from his aluminum-loaded mixture. He fired tests against steel plates donated by a local shipyard. The results were startling. Penetration increased by roughly 35% compared to standard Composition B charges of identical size. A 2-pound test charge punched completely through 3 inches of steel plate and carved a deep crater in the backing material behind it. The aluminum was doing exactly what Kistiakowsky predicted. It burned during detonation, superheating the explosive jet to temperatures exceeding 4,500 degrees Celsius and increasing its velocity. He documented everything in a classified report, submitted to the NDRC in June 1943, expecting immediate pushback from Army safety officials. Instead, desperation overruled caution. Intelligence reports from Sicily that summer showed American infantry struggling against German Panzer IVs and Tigers. Bazookas were bouncing off frontal armor with depressing regularity. By August, the Ordnance Department quietly authorized field trials of Kistiakowsky's composition, B+ in modified M6A3 Bazooka, warheads. Production plants received instructions to implement the new formula with enhanced safety, protocols, grounded equipment, humidity controls, and strict limits on batch sizes. Workers would be handling explosives 3 times more sensitive than anything they'd pressed before. But the potential payoff was 6 inches of penetration, enough to threaten every German tank except the Tiger's frontal plate. Kistiakowsky's banned powder mixture was going to war. Safety regulations be damned. Normandy's hedgerows turned into killing galleries within hours of the June 6, 1944 landings. These weren't decorative garden borders. They were 1,000-year-old earthen walls, 8 to 12 feet high, thick with roots and topped with dense brambles. German defenders used them brilliantly, positioning Panzer IVs and assault guns in hidden gaps where they could ambush advancing Sherman. Tanks at ranges under 100 yards. American armor crews found themselves trapped in narrow lanes with no room to maneuver, taking direct hits before they even saw the enemy. The 2nd Armored Division lost 47 tanks in the first week of hedgerow fighting, most destroyed before firing a single shot. Bazooka teams became the unexpected solution. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson of the 29th Infantry Division recorded one of the first successful engagements in his after-action report dated June 12, 1944. His squad was pinned in a sunken lane near St. Lo when a Panzer IV appeared 60 yards ahead, its 75mm gun traversing toward a disabled Sherman. Thompson's bazooka gunner, Private Eugene Lucero, fired from a kneeling position behind a hedgerow embankment. The M6A3 rocket, loaded with Kistiakowsky's aluminum-enhanced Composition B+, struck the Panzer's hull side at a nearly perpendicular angle. The shaped charge jet punched completely through the 50mm side armor, detonated ammunition stored inside, and blew the turret 15 feet into the air. Thompson noted in his report that the penetration hole was easily the size of a man's fist, with glowing edges. The effectiveness statistics compiled by 1st Army Ordnance officers that July told a remarkable story. Bazookas equipped with the new M6A3 warheads achieved a 68% kill rate against Panzer IV tanks when hits occurred, on-side or rear armor, even frontal shots against the Panzers, 80mm plates at angles. Less than 30 degrees from perpendicular achieved a 41% penetration rate. Not guaranteed kills, but enough to force German tank commanders to keep their distance or risk catastrophic damage. The 4th Infantry Division reported knocking out 23 German armored vehicles with bazookas during the Battle for Cherbourg in late June. compared to just 7 tank versus tank kills by their attached Sherman units. The Panther tank presented a tougher challenge, but even here, the upgraded bazookas proved their worth in unexpected ways. Lieutenant James Flowers of the 90th Infantry Division described an engagement near Perriers on July 8th, where his platoon encountered 2 Panthers blocking a crossroads. Direct frontal shots were useless against the Panthers' sloped 80mm glasses plate. The effective thickness approached 140mm when accounting for angle, but Flowers coordinated his bazooka teams to fire simultaneously at the tank's tracks and lower hull. 3 rockets disabled both Panthers' running gear, immobilizing them. Follow-up shots against the thinner rear armor, just 40mm, penetrated cleanly, forcing the crews to abandon their vehicles. The after-action report noted that aluminum residue from the shaped charge jets had fused with the internal surfaces, creating secondary incendiary effects that ignited fuel and ammunition. German tankers began changing tactics by mid-July. Captured documents from the 2nd Panzer Division included explicit warnings about American Panzerschreck teams, the Germans' own name for the bazooka, borrowed from their heavier Panzerschreck launcher. Tank commanders received orders to maintain distances beyond 150 yards when facing infantry, to never expose side armor, and to suppress suspected bazooka positions with machine gun fire immediately. The fact that German armor doctrine was adapting, specifically to counter a weapon that hadn't existed 3 years, earlier validated every risk Kistiakowsky had taken with his forbidden aluminum formula. The physics behind punching through 6 inches of steel with a 3-pound warhead defies common sense until you understand what's actually happening during detonation. Most people imagine shaped charges working like armor-piercing bullets, a hard projectile ramming through metal by sheer force. Reality involves no solid projectile at all. When Kistiakowsky's aluminum-enhanced explosive detonates behind a copper cone, it transforms that cone into something closer to a liquid metal jet moving at velocities that would make rifle bullets look stationary. The phenomenon relies on principles first documented by American chemist Charles Edward Monroe in 1888, though he had no idea he was laying groundwork for anti-tank warfare. Monroe discovered his effect almost by accident while testing gun-cotton explosives at the Naval Torpedo Station. He placed blocks of explosive against steel plates with the manufacturer's name embossed on one surface. After detonation, the steel plates bore deep impressions of those embossed letters, backwards and remarkably detailed. Monroe realized that cavities or indentations in explosive charges focused the detonation energy into concentrated jets. He published his findings in naval journals, but the military applications remained theoretical for decades. German researchers revived the concept in the 1930s. By 1938, Swiss engineer Henry Mohaupt had developed practical shaped charge artillery shells. The mathematics governing penetration depth involves multiple variables, but the critical factor is jet velocity. When the detonation wave from composition B+ collapses the copper cone inside a bazooka warhead, it accelerates the metal to velocities approaching 25,000 feet per second, roughly 23 times the speed of sound. This hypervelocity jet behaves according to hydrodynamic principles rather than solid mechanics. The copper effectively becomes a fluid stream that erodes through steel armor like high-pressure water cutting through sand. The penetration depth depends on jet length, velocity, and density. Kistiakowsky's aluminum addition increased both temperature and velocity, pushing the jet's effectiveness beyond what pure composition B could achieve. The cone geometry itself required precise engineering. American ordnance engineers standardized on a 42-degree cone angle for bazooka warheads after extensive testing in late 1943. Shallower angles produced longer jets but with reduced velocity. Steeper angles created faster jets that were too short to penetrate thick armor. The copper liner thickness mattered too. Too thin and it fragmented prematurely. Too thick, and the detonation couldn't collapse it. Efficiently, Aberdeen engineers settled on 0.042-inch copper sheeting drawn from oxygen-free high conductivity stock to ensure consistent performance. Every copper cone was inspected under magnification for surface flaws that could disrupt jet formation. The aluminum powder in Kistiakowsky's formula contributed through secondary reactions that traditional composition B lacked. When the detonation wave passed through the aluminum-loaded explosive, the metal particles underwent explosive oxidation, releasing additional thermal energy. This increased the jet temperature from roughly 3,800 degrees Celsius with standard composition B to over 4,500 with the aluminum-enhanced version. The hotter jet maintained its coherence over longer distances and penetrated more efficiently through the combination of kinetic energy and thermal erosion. German metallurgists analyzing captured American warheads in 1944 identified the aluminum content and reportedly attempted to duplicate the formula, but their safety concerns and material shortages prevented widespread adoption. Scaling up from Harvard laboratory, batches to 500,000 warheads monthly required industrial improvisation that would have terrified peacetime safety inspectors. The war productions. Board faced a logistical puzzle in August 1943. Composition. B+ was 3 times more sensitive to accidental detonation than any explosive American. Factories had handled at scale. Traditional ordnance plants used hydraulic presses, operated by workers standing directly beside the equipment. One spark, one grain of grit creating friction, one static discharge from dry winter air could detonate an entire batch of aluminum-loaded explosive. The initial safety estimates predicted worker casualty rates approaching 2% monthly, unacceptable even by wartime standards. The solution emerged from an unexpected source. Oldsmobile's Lansing, Michigan facility had been manufacturing M6A1 Bazooka warheads since January 1943 using standard composition B plant manager. Howard Beacom proposed adapting the assembly line techniques Oldsmobile used for automotive components. Instead of workers standing beside hydraulic presses, Beacom designed remote-controlled pressing stations where operators worked behind reinforced concrete barriers 12 feet thick. Workers observed the pressing process through periscope-style mirror systems borrowed from submarine technology. If a batch detonated, the blast would vent upward through frangible roof panels while the operator remained protected. The Army approved the design in September 1943, and Oldsmobile began their 90-day conversion. Recruitment for the expanded workforce targeted an overlooked labor pool: married women whose husbands were overseas. The Lansing facility hired 2,470 women between October 1943 and January 1944. Many with no industrial experience beyond household appliances. Training emphasized meticulous attention to detail over physical strength. New workers spent 3 weeks learning to inspect copper cone liners under magnification, identify contamination in explosive powder batches, and follow grounding procedures that prevented static buildup. Betty Fitzgerald, who joined the plant in November 1943 at age 23, later described the training in a 1986 oral history interview. They taught us to move deliberately, never rush, and treat every grain of that gray powder like it was nitroglycerin. Because functionally, it was. The production sequence began with copper blanks stamped from rolled sheets, then drawn into cone shapes using hydraulic presses operating at 12 tons of pressure. Workers inspected each cone for surface irregularities using backlit examination tables. Any scratch deeper than 0.03 inches meant rejection. Accepted. Cones moved to the explosive loading stations where composition B+ arrived in wax-coated pellets pre-mixed at the Holston plant in Tennessee. The pellets came packed in grounded metal containers filled with inert gas to prevent oxidation during transport. Workers wearing cotton, clothing and conductive footwear, leather shoes with copper rivets connecting to grounded floor mats, loaded precisely measured quantities of pellets into hydraulic pressing chambers. The pressing operation required extraordinary precision. Too little pressure, and the explosive wouldn't form a solid charge with consistent detonation characteristics. Too much pressure generated heat through friction that could trigger detonation. Oldsmobile engineers settled on a graduated pressing sequence. Initial compression at 1,500 pounds per square inch, followed by 3 incremental steps reaching 4,000 psi, with 30-second cooling intervals between steps. The entire pressing cycle took 7 minutes per warhead. Remote operators monitored pressure gauges and temperature sensors, aborting any batch that showed anomalous readings. Rejected charges were carefully transferred to blast containment vessels and transported to outdoor detonation pits for disposal. By March 1944, the Lansing facility reached production targets of 18,000 warheads daily. 2 additional plants came online that spring: General Motors, Flint facility, and a converted furniture factory in Grand Rapids, bringing combined output to 547,000 warheads monthly by May 1944, just in time for the Normandy invasion. The predicted casualty rates never materialized. Through careful engineering and exhaustive worker training, the 3 plants experienced only 2 fatal accidents during 1944, both involving transportation mishaps rather than production line failures. American industry had successfully mass-produced chemistry that academic labs considered too dangerous to handle, and delivered it to European battlefields, where it rewrote the rules of armored warfare. The Pacific Theater introduced challenges that European battlefields never presented. Japanese armor was comparatively lighter. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank featured just 25mm frontal armor, easily defeated by even standard composition B warheads. But Japanese defensive tactics centered on fortified positions carved into volcanic rock and coral limestone. Not tank battles. Iwo Jima became the proving ground where bazookas evolved from anti-tank weapons into bunker-busting tools. The island's 21,000 Japanese defenders had spent 8 months excavating 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, creating firing positions with reinforced concrete walls up to 4 feet thick and gun ports offering minimal target exposure. Marine Corps after-action reports from the February 1945 Iwo Jima invasion document how bazooka teams adapted their tactics. Traditional demolition charges required engineers to approach bunkers within arm's reach, suicidal against Japanese. Defenders who held fire until Americans were within grenade range. Bazookas offered standoff. Capability Corporal Tony Stein of the 28th Marines used his battalion's M9A1 bazooka, the improved 1943 model with aluminum-enhanced warheads, to systematically destroy 14 pillboxes during the Bay. First day's fighting on February 19th, his technique involved firing multiple rockets at the same impact point on concrete walls, with each detonation weakening the structure until the final shot punched through. Stein's citation noted that the shaped charge jets carved cavities 18 inches deep into reinforced concrete, fragmenting the material and creating spalling that killed defenders inside. The cave warfare on Okinawa from April through June 1945 pushed bazooka employment to extremes. Japanese forces had fortified over 400 cave complexes across the island's southern ridges. Artillery and flamethrowers proved largely ineffective. The caves extended too deep and featured multiple chambers with right-angle turns that deflected blast. Effects: Army intelligence officers examined captured Japanese defensive plans and discovered that many caves had been reinforced with steel rails and I-beams, salvaged from demolished infrastructure, creating barriers that conventional explosives couldn't breach. The 96th Infantry Division requested priority shipments of M20 Super Bazooka rockets, a larger 3.5-inch diameter variant loaded with 8.5 pounds of composition, B+ that had entered limited production in March 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Naylor's combat engineers pioneered a cave-clearing technique on Okinawa that combined bazookas with creative geometry. Teams would fire rockets at oblique angles into cave entrances, bouncing the projectiles off walls to reach interior chambers. The shaped charge jets would detonate against whatever surface the warhead finally struck, sometimes steel reinforcement, sometimes ammunition stores, frequently enemy personnel. The 7th Infantry Division reported clearing 87 cave positions using this method during May 1945, with average ammunition expenditure of 6.3 rockets per cave. The technique was dangerous. Ricochets occasionally brought rockets back toward American positions, but it reduced casualty rates by 70% compared to direct assault. Methods Korea brought bazookas full circle to anti-armor warfare. When North Korean T-34-85 tanks crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, these Soviet-supplied tanks featured 90mm frontal armor set at steep angles, effectively 130mm against perpendicular hits. Early American engagements proved disastrous. Task Force Smith's 2 bazooka teams fired 22 rockets at advancing T-34s on July 5, 1950, achieving 0 penetrations. The rockets were surplus. M6A3 warheads manufactured in 1944, their composition B-plus charges had degraded during 6 years of storage in humid Pacific conditions. Frantic cables reached the Pentagon demanding fresh ammunition and more powerful weapons. The solution arrived in August 1950 when the Marine Corps landed at Incheon carrying M20 super bazookas loaded with newly manufactured warheads. These used an updated formula designated Composition B4, containing 20% aluminum powder. Kistiakowsky's original ratio increased through better manufacturing safety controls developed since 1945 penetration. Performance against T-34 armor reached 8.5 inches under optimal conditions. Soviet technical intelligence teams analyzing knocked out T-34's recovered warhead fragments and identified the aluminum-loaded explosive composition. This analysis directly influenced Soviet development of the RPG-2 and subsequently the RPG-7, both of which incorporated aluminum powder in their warhead charges. A direct lineage back to the forbidden chemistry that Kistiakowsky pioneered in his Harvard laboratory 12 years earlier. The bazooka's conceptual descendants remain in service worldwide today. From American M72 Law rockets to Russian RPG-29s, every modern-shaped charge anti-tank weapon owes its effectiveness to the metallurgical principles and explosive chemistry refined during those desperate months in 1943 when penetrating German steel seemed impossible. Kistiakowsky's willingness to violate safety regulations in pursuit of better chemistry didn't just help win World War II. Established the fundamental approach that still governs anti-armor weapon design 8 decades later. Long after the last bazooka fired, the formula remained. Gray powder mixed in defiance of regulations. Chemistry born from desperation. A solution elegant enough to survive every war that followed.